Europe is standing at a strategic crossroads, where decisions made today could define the continent's security for decades to come. As NATO's Secretary-General issues stark warnings about war, budgets, and Ukraine's survival, European leaders debate peace talks, defense spending, and political responsibility, revealing deep fractures beneath the surface of unity. This analysis unpacks how these statements, signals, and contradictions fit together, and why the consequences extend far beyond the battlefield in Ukraine. Mark Rutte's remarks to Bild were not casual commentary, they were a carefully calibrated warning aimed at both political leaders and the public across the NATO alliance. At the heart of his message is a blunt strategic calculation: European security is now inseparable from Ukraine's ability to resist Russia, and the price of prevention today is far lower than the cost of reaction tomorrow. When Rutte argues that NATO must simultaneously increase defense spending, accelerate arms production, and ensure Ukraine maintains maximum military capability, he is effectively reframing the war. It is no longer presented as a distant conflict on Europe's periphery, but as a forward defense line for the entire Euro-Atlantic order. Rutte's statement that Christmas will remain safe only if NATO spends more is striking not for its seasonal imagery, but for its political intent. It brings abstract budget debates into the everyday lives of citizens, suggesting that peace at home now depends on industrial output, ammunition stockpiles, and political resolve. His warning that a Russian takeover of Ukraine would force NATO to spend much more later underscores a core deterrence logic. Failing to stop aggression early encourages escalation. From a strategic perspective, Ukraine functions as a buffer state whose collapse would radically shorten NATO's eastern defensive depth, pushing direct confrontation closer to alliance borders. The numbers Rutte cited are equally revealing. NATO estimates that Russia has suffered up to 1.1 million killed and wounded while gaining less than 1% of Ukrainian territory over the course of a year. This statistic serves a dual purpose. On one hand, it highlights the extraordinary human cost Moscow is willing to accept, reinforcing the idea that conventional deterrence based on casualties alone does not restrain the Kremlin. On the other hand, it exposes the inefficiency and brutality of Russia's military strategy, suggesting that territorial gains achieved through mass attrition are neither sustainable nor strategically decisive. Politically, this challenges any narrative that Russia is winning the war in a meaningful sense. Rutte's comments on Russia's internal politics further deepen the strategic framing. By warning against naive expectations about a post-Putin Russia, he pushes back against the recurring hope in parts of Europe that a leadership change in Moscow would automatically reduce the threat. His position is clear: NATO must plan based on capabilities and behavior, not personalities. This reflects a broader institutional lesson learned since 2014, that Russian foreign policy has shown continuity across leadership cycles, especially when it comes to opposing NATO expansion and Western influence. The global dimension Rutte introduces, particularly the Russia-China connection, adds another layer of urgency. By linking a potential crisis over Taiwan with European destabilization, he signals that security theaters are increasingly interconnected. The implication is that a conflict in East Asia could stretch Western resources and attention, while Russia exploits the moment to pressure Europe. This is not presented as speculation, but as a realistic contingency that defense planners must take seriously. In this context, increased European defense spending is not just about Ukraine or Russia, but about NATO's credibility in a world of simultaneous crises. While NATO's military leadership is sounding the alarm, Europe's political class is simultaneously exploring the possibility of dialogue with Moscow, exposing a deep and unresolved tension in the continent's strategy. This contradiction is most visible in France. President Emmanuel Macron's call for Europe to find its own way to engage directly with Vladimir Putin marks a significant shift in tone, though not necessarily in substance. Macron is careful to frame any future dialogue as transparent and coordinated with Ukraine, insisting that Europe must have a seat at the negotiating table rather than relying exclusively on US-led diplomacy. Politically, this reflects France's long-standing ambition for European strategic autonomy, even as the war has repeatedly underscored Europe's dependence on NATO and American military power. The response from the Kremlin, conveyed through spokesman Dmitry Peskov, was swift and calculated: Putin is ready for talks with Macron. The Élysée Palace welcomed this signal and announced that conditions for possible talks would be determined in the coming days. Timing is critical here. These statements come amid growing European anxiety about the long-term trajectory of the war, rising defense costs, and public fatigue. Dialogue, in this context, is less about immediate peace and more about keeping diplomatic channels open in a conflict that shows no clear end. Yet history suggests that Moscow often uses negotiations tactically to buy time, reduce pressure, or fracture Western unity, raising questions about how much political capital Europe should invest in such talks. At the same time, warnings from NATO member states on Europe's eastern flank point in the opposite direction. Several countries, including Estonia, Lithuania, and Poland, have stated that Russia could be ready for a large-scale confrontation with NATO within 3 to 5 years after the war in Ukraine ends. Their response has been concrete rather than rhetorical, plans to spend over 5% of GDP on defense next year. This is a dramatic figure by NATO standards and sends a clear political message that frontline states no longer view the 2% benchmark as sufficient. For them, the war in Ukraine is not a cautionary tale, it is a preview. These fears are reinforced by intelligence assessments. European Defense Commissioner Andreas Kubilius cited German intelligence indicating that the Kremlin has discussed scenarios involving an attack on NATO. Meanwhile, the Institute for the Study of War reports that Russia has intensified information and psychological operations, potentially as part of broader preparations for confrontation, including false flag provocations. Former Finnish Prime Minister Petteri Orpo added another layer of concern by warning that a ceasefire or peace agreement in Ukraine could allow Russia to redeploy experienced troops to NATO's eastern flank. The implication is stark: peace on paper does not necessarily mean reduced danger in reality. Moscow, for its part, rejects these claims outright. Vladimir Putin has dismissed the idea of Russian plans to attack NATO as nonsense and impossible to believe. This denial follows a familiar pattern, echoing similar statements made before earlier escalations. From a political analysis standpoint, such rhetoric is less about reassurance and more about narrative control, aimed at sowing doubt within European societies about the necessity of higher defense spending and sustained support for Ukraine. The final and perhaps most politically sensitive dimension of this debate lies within Europe itself, where unity over Ukraine is increasingly tested by national interests, domestic politics, and competing visions of peace. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban's statement that Ukraine's collapse would be a disaster for Hungary appears, at first glance, to align with NATO's broader concern about regional stability. Orban emphasized Hungary's energy ties with Ukraine, noting that Budapest supplies 44% of Ukraine's electricity and 58% of its gas, and warned that instability next door would have severe consequences. In purely economic and infrastructural terms, this assessment is difficult to dispute. Yet Orban's broader political messaging undermines that apparent alignment. His claim that in the war between Ukraine and Russia it is unclear who attacked whom represents a striking departure from the established facts of the conflict and places Hungary increasingly at odds with its EU and NATO partners. This statement, made in the context of European debates over further financial support for Kyiv, is not a neutral call for peace but a political signal aimed at both domestic and international audiences. It feeds into a narrative of moral equivalence that weakens collective resolve and creates space for Russian disinformation to take hold. The response from Ukraine was sharp and historically charged. Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha reminded Orban that Horthyra Hungary voluntarily allied with Nazi Germany during World War II and participated in aggression against both European states and the Soviet Union. This rebuttal was not merely rhetorical, it was a warning about the dangers of historical amnesia and selective interpretation. By invoking history, Kyiv underscored a core lesson of European security: ambiguity in the face of aggression has consequences, and attempts to blur responsibility often embolden the aggressor rather than constrain it. These internal fractures matter because they directly affect NATO's ability to act coherently. Mark Rutte's insistence that Ukraine must remain as strong as possible is not just a military assessment, it is a political demand for sustained unity. If support for Ukraine weakens due to fatigue, opportunism, or false neutrality, the strategic burden does not disappear, it shifts forward. As Ruta warned, a Russia that controls Ukraine would pose a far more direct and costly threat to NATO, forcing European societies to accept higher defense spending, permanent military mobilization, and a more dangerous security environment.